Welcome to Greyvale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Today, we unearth a historical mystery from the sands of time. A cursed relic, brought to a quiet London study, carries with it an otherworldly force. For one man, the night will not bring rest, but wrath. The story begins not in the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, but in the heart of a London fog, within the four walls of a room that was supposed to be a sanctuary. It was the study of a man named Malcolm Ross, and on this particular night, it had ceased to be a place of comfort and had become a cage. Malcolm was a scholar, a man whose entire life was built upon the foundations of logic, reason, and empirical evidence. His world was one of facts, of dusty tomes and catalogued artifacts, of histories that could be traced and verified. He believed in what he could see, touch, and measure. The supernatural, the paranormal, the world of ghosts and curses. These were, to him, the fanciful daydreams of the uneducated, the charming but ultimately hollow myths of past civilizations. But on this night, the foundations of his well-ordered world were about to be turned to dust. He was alone, as he often was, late into the evening. The house around him was silent, a sleeping giant in the damp London streets. A fire, once roaring, had dwindled to a bed of sullen, glowing embers in the hearth, casting a weak, orange pulse that did little to combat the encroaching shadows. The only other light came from a heavy brass oil lamp on his desk, its single steady flame a small island of order in a growing sea of darkness. Outside, a thick fog pressed against the window panes, blurring the world into a murky, indistinct watercolor. It was a typical London night, the kind Malcolm had experienced 1,000 times before. But tonight, something was different. An unease, as thick and cloying as the fog outside, had settled in the room with him. It was a feeling he could not name, an irrational anxiety that pricked at the edges of his consciousness. He tried to dismiss it. He was tired, he told himself. He had spent the last week in a state of feverish excitement, barely sleeping, his mind consumed by his latest acquisition. It was only natural that his nerves would be frayed. He picked up a book, a dense volume on Ptolemaic dynasties, hoping the familiar weight of academic text would ground him, would chase away the formless dread. But the words on the page were meaningless. The crisp, black letters refused to arrange themselves into coherent thoughts. They were just symbols, empty of the logic they were meant to contain. His attention kept drifting. Against his will, his gaze would lift from the page, travel across the cluttered expanse of his desk past stacks of paper, a forgotten teacup, an assortment of archaeological tools, and land upon the object. The prize. The reason for his sleepless nights and his current, inexplicable disquiet. There, in the very center of his desk, lying on a square of deep blue velvet, was the thing that had consumed him. It was the source of his academic triumph, and, he was beginning to suspect, the source of the poison that was now seeping into the air of his study. It was an ancient Egyptian collar, a magnificent wisek, the kind worn by royalty or high priests in the age of the pharaohs. It had been unearthed just months earlier from a previously undiscovered tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a tomb rumored to belong to a mysterious queen known only as Terra. The official excavation team had catalogued most of the findings, but this piece, through a series of clandestine negotiations and a small fortune of Malcolm's own money, had found its way here to his private collection. It was the centerpiece of his life's work, the jewel of 7 stars, and it was magnificent. Even in the dim lamplight, its craftsmanship was breathtaking. It was wrought from electrum, that pale, silvery gold alloy favored by the ancients, and fashioned into a broad, crescent shape designed to rest upon the collarbones. Intricate engravings covered its surface. Scenes of offerings, processions of gods with the heads of jackals and falcons, and rows of hieroglyphs so finely carved they seemed to have been etched by a divine hand. But its true glory, the feature that gave it its name, was the 7 enormous gems embedded in its design. They were not diamonds or rubies, nothing so common. They were stones Malcolm had never seen before, each one a perfect, 7-sided heptagon. They were a deep, smoky black, and they possessed a strange, anti-luster. Instead of reflecting the lamplight, they seemed to absorb it. The flame of the lamp danced in the polished metal surrounding them, but the gems themselves remained dark, like 7 small portals into a lightless void. They were like the eyes of a predator, watchful and patient, holding secrets in their dark, silent depths. He had spent hours studying it, sketching it, writing notes on its unique construction. He should have felt a sense of triumph, of pure academic satisfaction. Instead, looking at it now, he felt a flicker of something that bordered on fear. The collar did not feel like an object. It did not feel dead. In the deep silence of the room, lying there on its velvet bed, It seemed to possess a kind of latent energy, a coiled potential, like a serpent asleep in the sun. It was a cursed relic, the whispers in the Cairo marketplace had said. A thing of otherworldly power, taken from a tomb that should never have been opened. Malcolm had scoffed at such talk then. He was a man of science. But now, alone in the quiet of his study, with the fog pressing at the glass and the shadows growing longer, those whispers didn't seem so foolish. This feeling intensified as he became more aware of the room around him. His study was his fortress. Every book on its shelf was a friend. Every artifact on display a memory. The worn leather of his armchair, the familiar scent of old paper and pipe tobacco, these things were the very fabric of his comfort. But tonight that comfort had evaporated. The room felt alien, hostile. It was as if he had walked into a perfect replica of his study, but one where all the warmth and familiarity had been surgically removed. The shadows in the corners, usually soft and gentle, now seemed unnaturally deep and sharp, as if they were not simply an absence of light, but a presence of darkness. They pooled in the corners of the room like black water, and he had the distinct and unsettling feeling that if he were to stare into them for too long, he might see something stare back. The silence, too, had changed. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a late night. It had become a heavy, listening silence. It was the hush of an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. The very air felt thick and expectant, charged with a static of anticipation. And it seemed to him that the focus of this anticipation, the conductor of the silent orchestra, was the collar on his desk. It was as if the ancient artifact had imposed its own atmosphere on the room, replacing the comfortable quiet of a London study with the profound, tomb-like stillness of a sealed chamber beneath the Egyptian sands. He felt like an intruder in his own home. The study no longer belonged to him. It had become a temporary temple for a dark and sleeping god. He tried to shake off the feeling, to rationalize it away. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly in the silence, the sound making him flinch. He walked over to the fireplace and poked at the embers, sending a brief flurry of orange sparks up the chimney. A mundane action, a normal action. He was trying to reassert his control over the space, to remind himself that this was his room, governed by the normal laws of physics. As he turned back toward his desk, it happened. The first undeniable touch of the unnatural. A wave of intense, piercing cold washed over him. It was so sudden and so profound that it made him gasp, his breath clouding in front of him as if it were a winter's day. But the room was not cold. The embers in the hearth still gave off a gentle warmth, and the windows were sealed tight against the night. This was not a physical cold. It was something else. It did not come from the air. It felt as if it had emanated from a single point in the room and moved directly through him. A wave of invisible ice that seeped past his clothes and skin and into his very bones. It was a cold that felt ancient. A deep, cellular cold that carried with it a sense of immense age and profound emptiness. It was the cold of the grave. He stood frozen for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest. His logical mind scrambled for an explanation. A draft? A sudden drop in his own body temperature? But he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that those explanations were false. The cold had a source. And as the sensation faded, leaving him trembling, he realized that the wave had come from the direction of his desk. He looked at the jewel of 7 stars. It lay there impassive, unchanged. The 7 black gems were as dark and lifeless as ever. But he knew that the chill, that first whisper of a paranormal power, had radiated directly from the collar. It was the relic's first breath in its new home. It was a quiet, cold sigh, a stirring in its long slumber. It was a warning, and it was a promise of what was to come. The historical mystery was no longer just a subject of study. It had followed him home, and it was now sitting on his desk, slowly, patiently, beginning to wake up. The wave of unnatural cold passed, but it left an echo behind. It was a residue of fear, a greasy film that coated Malcolm's thoughts and refused to be wiped away. He stood trembling by the hearth, his hand gripping the mantelpiece for support, his knuckles white. The logical part of his brain, the scholar, the skeptic, was in full retreat. It offered up a dozen feeble explanations for the chill, a frantic volley of rationalizations meant to defend the borders of his reality. A psychosomatic reaction, it suggested, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and obsession. He was projecting his own anxieties onto the room, manufacturing a supernatural experience where none existed. He clung to these thoughts like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, but he knew, in the deepest part of his soul, that the ship of his certainty had already sunk. He forced himself to move, to take a slow, deliberate breath. The air he drew in no longer felt normal. It was thin and sharp, and it carried something new, a scent. It was the first hint of the next stage of the room's transformation. At first, it was so faint he wasn't even sure it was there. It was a ghost of a smell, a subtle note that danced at the very edge of his perception. He sniffed the air, trying to place it. It wasn't the familiar London scent of damp coal smoke and wet earth. It wasn't the comfortable aroma of old books and leather from his own study. This was something else entirely, something alien. It was an ancient aroma, dry and complex. It grew in strength, not gradually, but in faint, pulsing waves, as if an invisible door were opening and closing somewhere nearby, letting in drafts of air from another time, another place. It was a scent composed of a dozen different elements, all of them strange and evocative. There was a dominant note of spice, but not the familiar spices of an English kitchen. This was the pungent, aromatic scent of myrrh and cassia, the sacred perfumes used in ancient temples for embalming the dead and honoring the gods. Beneath that was a dusty, papery smell, the smell of brittle, yellowed linen and dried papyrus scrolls, of things that had been sealed away from light and air for millennia. And under it all was a faint mineral tang, the dry, clean scent of sand and stone, of the desert at midnight. It was the scent of the tomb. Malcolm knew that smell intimately. He had experienced it before, that first rush of displaced air when a sealed chamber was breached after 3,000 years of solitude. But that was in Egypt, under a blazing sun, surrounded by a team of excavators. To smell it here in his foggy London study was a profound and terrifying violation. The scent was not just in the air. It seemed to be seeping from the very walls, rising from the floorboards. It was as if the room itself were slowly transmuting, its English identity being overwritten by an ancient, Egyptian one. The cursed relic on his desk was no longer just an object in the room. It was a seed, a focal point from which a new environment was beginning to grow, and its roots were pushing through the floor of his reality. He backed away from the desk, a primitive instinct telling him to put distance between himself and the source of this olfactory haunting. He stumbled back toward the window, his hand reaching for the heavy velvet curtains, his mind needing the reassurance of the familiar, mundane world outside. He pulled the curtain aside, expecting to see the comforting, blurry glow of a gaslight down the street. But as he did, a new impossibility confronted him. The flame of the heavy oil lamp on his desk, which had been burning with a placid, unwavering stillness for hours, suddenly leaped and danced with a wild, frantic energy. It ducked and swayed, stretching into a long, thin ribbon of fire before shrinking back to a sputtering nub, as if it were being battered by a powerful, invisible gale. The glass chimney rattled in its brass holder. Malcolm stared, bewildered. The room was sealed. The window he stood beside was locked tight, its sash uncompromisingly shut. The door to the hallway was closed. There was no source for a draft, let alone a wind strong enough to threaten the lamp's flame with extinguishment. And yet, he felt it. An impossible wind began to coil around him. It wasn't a cold wind, not like the wave of chill he had felt before. This was a dry, warm wind, and it carried the grit of the desert on its breath. He could feel it stirring the hair on his head, whispering against his cheek. It smelled strongly of the dust and sand he had just identified in the air, a physical confirmation of the scent's origin. The wind swirled around the room in a silent, invisible vortex, its currents plucking at the loose papers on his desk, making them rustle and lift as if touched by unseen hands. A page of his own notes, filled with his neat, logical script, lifted into the air, fluttered for a moment like a panicked bird, and then settled back onto the desk. This was not just a paranormal event. It was an act of invasion. The environment of a place thousands of miles and thousands of years away was actively manifesting in his study. The scent, the wind, the very air he was breathing it was all being replaced. The entity connected to the relic was not just haunting his room. It was terraforming it, recreating the conditions of its original home, making the space suitable for its own emergence. The comfortable London study was becoming an antechamber to a tomb, and Malcolm was trapped inside. With this impossible wind came a new sensation, a physical pressure that was even more disturbing. The atmosphere in the room, which had already felt heavy and expectant, now became truly oppressive. It was a crushing weight that seemed to press down on him from above, a palpable burden that made his shoulders ache and his neck bow. He felt a distinct, physical pressure on his chest, as if a heavy stone slab were being slowly lowered upon him. Each breath became a struggle, not because the air was thin, but because he had to fight against this immense, invisible weight to expand his own lungs. It was the weight of ages. That was the only way he could describe it. He felt as if the entire history of the ancient civilization that had produced the collar was being focused into a single point, and that point was his study. The pressure was the condensed weight of 30 centuries of silence, of all the tons of rock and sand that had sat atop Queen Tara's tomb, of the immense, slow passage of time itself. It was an otherworldly force making its presence known, not through a subtle chill or a ghostly scent, but through a brute force application of its immense power. The room was groaning under the strain. He thought he could hear the old wooden timbers of the house creaking, not with the familiar settling of age, but with a new, agonized sound of a structure being subjected to an impossible load. He felt small, insignificant, a fragile, modern man caught under the heel of an ancient and immeasurable power. His own lifetime, his own knowledge, his own reality, it was all a mayfly's dream compared to the eternal, patient weight of the thing that was now filling his room. The force was indifferent to him. He was not its target, not yet. He was simply an obstacle, an incidental piece of furniture in the space it was claiming for its own. The pressure was not malicious. It was simply a side effect of its sheer presence, the way a mountain's gravity shapes the landscape around it. And then he began to hear the voices. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind. As the invisible currents swirled around the room, rustling the papers and making the lamp flame dance, he began to hear a new sound woven within it. It was a faint, sibilant whispering, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. It was the sound of sand being stirred by a serpent's passage. It was the sound of brittle papyrus being unrolled by desiccated, ancient hands. He strained his ears, trying to catch the words, but there were none. It was a chorus of whispers, a multitude of voices all speaking at once, their words too faint, too dry, too alien to be deciphered. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They coiled out of the shadows. They rode on the currents of the warm, sandy wind. They seemed to emanate from the very walls. But as he listened, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the oppressive weight on his chest, he realized the sound was clearer in one direction. It was strongest near the desk. The whispers were flowing from the Jewel of 7 Stars. The artifact was no longer just radiating cold or scent. It was now speaking. It was broadcasting this chorus of forgotten, ghostly voices into the room. Were they the voices of the priests who had consecrated it? The slaves who had died building the tomb? The soul of the queen herself? He didn't know. All he knew was that the sound was ancient, full of a dry, dusty sorrow and a faint, simmering rage. The whispers were not intended for him to understand. They were the sound of the relic's consciousness stirring, the first murmurs of a mind that had been asleep for millennia, now beginning to remember itself. The paranormal events were no longer separate, isolated occurrences. They were now a symphony, a coordinated assault on his senses. The scent of the tomb, the impossible desert wind, the crushing weight of ages, and the dry, sibilant whispers of the dead, they all worked together, weaving a tapestry of such profound and intricate horror that his mind, his logical, scientific mind, began to fray at the seams. He was not just witnessing a paranormal event. He was at the center of it, and it was changing him, eroding his sanity, breaking down the walls of his reality one sensory brick at a time. The chilling encounter he had unknowingly begun when he acquired the relic was now truly underway. And this, he realized with a final, soul-shattering wave of terror, was only the prelude. The overture was over. The real performance was about to begin. Malcolm's world had been reduced to a whirlwind of terrifying sensations. He was a prisoner in his own study, besieged by the sights, sounds, and smells of a world that should not exist. The crushing weight on his chest made every breath a battle, and the dry, whispering voices scratched at the inside of his skull, a constant, maddening chorus of the dead. He had stumbled back against the wall, his body sliding down into a crouch, his hands pressed over his ears in a futile attempt to block out the sound. But the whispers were not a physical noise. They were inside his head, a psychic infestation. He was no longer a scholar observing a phenomenon. He was the phenomenon's subject, a specimen pinned to a board, writhing as the experiment began in earnest. His eyes, wide with a terror he had never known, were fixed on the source of it all, the Jewel of 7 Stars. It lay on his desk, an island of stillness in the swirling chaos of the room. It was the eye of the storm, and as he watched, helpless, the storm's eye began to open. It began with the first light. The 7 black, heptagonal gems, which had been so stubbornly absorbing the lamplight, began to change. Deep within the center of each dark stone, a tiny pinprick of light appeared. It was not the warm, golden glow of the lamp. It was a cold, sickly, greenish-white light, the color of phosphorescence, the light of decay and deep-sea monstrosities. It was a dead light, and it held no warmth, no comfort. At first, the pinpricks were so small they were barely visible, like distant, dying stars in a black, empty universe. But they did not remain small. With an unnerving, organic slowness, the light within each gem began to grow. It expanded outwards from the central point, a slow-motion explosion of cold fire. The light bled through the blackness of the gems, transforming them from opaque voids into translucent, glowing vessels. They were no longer stones. They were now lanterns, each one lit from within by a captive spectral flame. The light was not steady, pulsed. Each of the 7 gems began to throb with a slow, rhythmic luminescence, beating in perfect, eerie unison. Glow, fade, it was a slow, deliberate rhythm, like the beating of a single, immense, 7-chambered heart. The light they cast was ghostly and strange. It did not illuminate the room so much as it painted it with a veneer of the supernatural. It pushed back against the warm, friendly glow of the oil lamp, overwhelming it, tainting it. The familiar objects in the study, the books, the furniture, the brass instruments were now bathed in this cold, greenish-white pulse. Their shapes became distorted, their colors sickly and wrong. The room no longer looked like a part of his world. It looked like a scene from a nightmare, rendered in the palette of the grave. The pulsing light was hypnotic. Malcolm found he couldn't look away. It was a beacon, a signal fire lit across the chasm of 3,000 years, and it was burning just for him. The whispers in his head seemed to grow stronger with each pulse, rising in volume and intensity, as if the light were giving them strength, giving them voice. The cursed relic was no longer a passive object. It had awakened. It was demonstrating its power, broadcasting its presence not just through subtle sensory tricks, but with a direct, undeniable display of otherworldly energy. The paranormal event had escalated from a haunting to a full-scale invasion. As the gems continued their slow, rhythmic heartbeat of light, a new element was added to the terrifying symphony, a vibration. It did not start as a sound. It was a feeling, a deep, resonant tremor that Malcolm felt rising up through the floorboards, through the soles of his shoes, and into the very marrow of his bones. It was a low, powerful hum, a frequency so deep it was almost infrasonic. It was the purr of a colossal, unseen engine waking from a long slumber. He looked at the desk, the heavy oak table, a solid, immovable piece of furniture that weighed hundreds of pounds, had begun to tremble. At first, it was a subtle shiver, a faint vibration that made the teacup on its surface rattle gently in its saucer. But the vibration grew in strength, synchronized with the pulsing of the gems. With each pulse of green light, a more powerful tremor would shake the desk. The rattling of the teacup became a frantic clattering. The stacks of paper on the desk began to shift and slide. A heavy inkwell skittered across the polished wood, leaving a dark, snaking trail behind it, like a line of black blood. The hum grew louder, rising in pitch until it was an audible guttural growl that filled the entire room. The vibration was no longer confined to the desk. The entire floor was shaking now. The books on the shelves rattled against each other, their leather spines chattering like teeth. A small, framed map on the wall shook so violently that it fell from its hook, the sound of the shattering glass as sharp and shocking as a gunshot in the humming silence. This was not a subtle psychological trick. This was a raw, physical manifestation of power. This was telekinesis. An object was exerting its will upon the physical world, shaking a room with the force of a localized earthquake. Malcolm's scientific mind, already battered and bruised, suffered a fatal blow. The laws of physics had not just been bent. They had been shattered, and their shards were lying on the floor along with the broken glass of the picture frame. The world he knew, the solid, dependable world of cause and effect, was a flimsy facade, and something ancient and powerful was now tearing it down right in front of him. He pressed himself harder against the wall, making himself small, trying to will himself into invisibility. He was terrified that the vibrating force would turn its attention to him, that it would shake him apart as easily as it was shaking the furniture. The relic's power was immense, untamed, and utterly indifferent to the fragile, fleshy thing cowering in the corner. He was nothing. The only thing that mattered was the jewel, and its slow, terrifying awakening. And then, the light from the gems began to perform a new, terrible magic. The cold, pulsing, greenish-white light cast by the 7 stones was throwing shadows across the room. But these were not normal shadows. A shadow should be a simple reflection of the object that casts it, a dark, inert copy. These shadows were alive. As the light from the gems pulsed, the shadows on the wall behind the desk began to move. The shadow of the lamp, the shadow of the inkwell, the shadow of the collar itself, they stretched and contracted with each beat of light, like dark, elastic things. But they weren't just stretching. They were twisting, writhing, rearranging themselves. The shadows detached from the objects that should have been casting them, flowing like black liquid across the wallpaper. They merged and separated, coalescing into new and terrifying forms. Malcolm watched, his breath hitched in his throat, as the amorphous, dancing shadows began to resolve into recognizable shapes. They were hieroglyphs, enormous, sprawling symbols of ancient Egypt, written in pure, living darkness on the wall of his study. He recognized them instantly. His life's work had been the study of these very symbols, but he had only ever seen them carved in stone or painted on papyrus. He had never seen them written in the language of nightmare. There, crawling across the wall, was the shadow shape of an ankh, the symbol of life, but it was twisted, distorted, its loop broken, signifying a life that had been corrupted. Next to it, the Jed pillar, the symbol of stability, formed and then crumbled into a pile of shadow dust, a depiction of a world losing its foundation. Then came the more menacing symbols. A long, serpentine shadow slithered across the wall of Pep, the serpent of chaos, the eternal enemy of the sun god Ra. A jackal's head took shape, its long snout sniffing the air, the form of Anubis, the god of the dead and embalming, the guide who led souls into the underworld. The shadow play was a message. It was a story being told in the relic's native tongue. It was a warning, a visual representation of the chaos and death that it had brought into his quiet, ordered world. The symbols were not static. They moved, they fought. He saw the shadow of a falcon Harusto battle with the serpent, their dark forms clashing and writhing in a silent, epic struggle on the wall. The very myths he had studied as historical narratives were being enacted in front of him as a living, breathing reality made of nothing but light and its absence. This was a chilling encounter of the most profound kind, a direct communication from a long-dead culture, a message delivered through a medium of pure fear. And as he watched this terrifying, silent movie, he felt the final stage of the relic's awakening begin, a psychic pull. It started as a faint pressure in the center of his forehead, a tingling sensation, as if an invisible finger were pressing against his skull. The feeling grew rapidly in intensity, becoming a powerful, undeniable force. It was a mental hook, and it was lodged deep inside his mind. The relic was no longer just broadcasting its power outwards. It was now focusing it, directing it at him. It was calling to him. The whispers in his head, which had been a chaotic, multi-voiced chorus, now began to coalesce into a single dominant thought, a command that was not his own. Come closer. The thought was not in English, not in any language he could name. It was a pure, conceptual command, a wave of intention that bypassed language entirely. Look at me. Touch me. Be one with me. He felt his body respond against his will. His muscles, which had been locked in a paralyzed crouch, began to twitch. His legs straightened. He felt an irresistible urge to stand up, to walk towards the desk, to reach out and touch the glowing, pulsing gems. His mind screamed in protest, a frantic, terrified rebellion against this psychic violation. He fought it with every ounce of his remaining willpower, his muscles straining as he tried to resist the unseen force that was pulling him forward. It was a silent, internal war, his own consciousness versus the ancient, powerful will of the artifact. The pull was immense. It was a tractor beam, a mental gravity that was drawing his very essence, his soul towards the collar. He could feel the relic's consciousness now, not just as whispers, but as a distinct personality. It was ancient, vast, and utterly devoid of anything he could recognize as human emotion. There was no anger, no malice, not yet. There was only a cold, reptilian hunger, a deep, abyssal need. It had been asleep for 30 centuries, and it had woken up hungry. And he, the fragile, warm, living creature in the room with it, was the only sustenance available. The pull intensified. He felt his body lurch forward, his feet shuffling on the floor as he lost his battle against the psychic tide. He was being reeled in like a fish on a line. Closer. Come to me. You are mine. The command echoed in the silent spaces of his mind. He was losing. He was going to walk to that desk. He was going to reach out his hand, and he was going to touch the cold, glowing heart of the nightmare. He knew, with a certainty that eclipsed all his other fears, that if he touched it, his mind, his soul, his very identity, would be unraveled and consumed. This was the true nature of the curse. Not death, but absorption. The ultimate chilling encounter. The complete and utter annihilation of the self. He was moments away from becoming just another whisper in the relic's ancient, ghostly chorus. The battle for Malcolm's will was a silent, internal scream against a current of immense power. The psychic pull of the relic was an inexorable tide, and he was a drowning man, his strength failing, his consciousness being dragged out into a deep, dark ocean. He had been pulled to his feet, his body a puppet whose strings were held by the glowing collar on the desk. He took one shuffling, involuntary step forward, then another. The command echoed in his mind, a hypnotic mantra of damnation. Closer. Come. You are mine. Every fiber of his being recoiled in terror, but his body was no longer his own. The ancient will of the jewel was now his master. He was being led to his own execution, a condemned man walking the final, terrible yard to the scaffold. The room had reached a crescendo of paranormal chaos. The floor vibrated with a deep, guttural hum. The cold, green light of the 7 gems pulsed like a diseased heart, painting the walls with writhing, hieroglyphic shadows. The air was thick with the scent of the tomb and the crushing weight of ages. It was a complete sensory apocalypse, a private, localized end of the world. But just as Malcolm took a third, final step that would bring him within arm's reach of the desk, something in the room shifted. The focus of the power changed. It happened in the far corner of the study, the corner most deeply submerged in shadow, a place the lamplight and even the ghostly green glow of the gems had failed to penetrate. The darkness there, which had been a passive, inert black, began to stir. It was the same phenomenon he had witnessed earlier, but on a much grander and more terrifying scale. The shadows began to coalesce. They were no longer just an absence of light. They were gathering, concentrating, pulling in darkness from the rest of the room. It was like watching a black hole form, a point of infinite density that was drawing all the shadows of the study towards it. The darkness swirled and eddied like black smoke caught in a whirlwind, a silent, churning vortex of pure night. As the darkness gathered, it began to rise, pulling itself upwards from the floor. It was a formless, churning pillar of black smoke, a chaotic column of nothingness. But then it began to take shape. The chaotic swirling slowed, and the pillar began to resolve itself, condensing and compacting into a defined, recognizable silhouette. It was the shape of a person, a tall, impossibly thin figure, its form unnaturally elongated, its limbs long and slender. The smoke-like texture solidified, the edges sharpening, until it was no longer a cloud, but a solid object sculpted from the material of the night itself. With the appearance of this new figure, the psychic pull on Malcolm vanished. The strings that had been dragging him forward were cut. He stumbled, his own will flooding back into his limbs, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping, his mind suddenly his own again. The relic's attention had shifted. It was no longer focused on him. Its power, its will, its entire being was now focused on giving form to this new apparition. The collar was the projector. The figure in the corner was the image it was projecting into his world. The spectral figure became clearer with every passing second, the details sharpening as if a lens were being brought into focus. It was a man or the ghost of a man from an age long dead. He was dressed in the fashion of the ancient Nile. His body was wrapped in fine, ghostly linen, the bandages clinging to a skeletal frame. A magnificent ornate headdress, a nemes of striped, shadowy fabric, covered his head, with the divine cobra, the uraeus, rearing from his brow, its empty eyes seeming to stare directly into Malcolm's soul. His face was gaunt and regal, his skin the color of dried papyrus, his cheekbones sharp, his lips a thin, bloodless line. But his eyes were the most terrible part. They were not eyes at all. They were 2 dark, empty voids, hollow sockets that held not darkness, but a profound and ancient emptiness. They were windows into the silent, starless abyss of the Egyptian underworld, the Duat. And yet, though they were empty, those eyes were fixed upon Malcolm. They pinned him in place with a gaze that was more potent than any physical restraint. This was not the indifferent, hungry force of the relic. This was a consciousness, personality, and it was filled with an emotion that was terrifyingly clear. A cold, silent, and absolute fury. This was the Phantom of the Nile, the wrathful guardian of the tomb, and it had been summoned from its eternal rest. This was the true master of the relic, the original owner of the curse. The apparition was fully formed now, a solid statue of rage and shadow standing in the corner of the room. The chaotic energy in the study seemed to bow to its presence. The vibrating hum lessened. The whispering voices in Malcolm's head fell silent. All the power that had been diffused throughout the room was now concentrated in this single silent figure. The air grew intensely cold, a frigid, deathly chill that emanated from the phantom, far more potent than the initial wave of cold he had felt earlier. The moisture in the air condensed on the walls, and a thin layer of frost began to creep across the window panes, the intricate, feathery patterns like the skeletal wings of a dead bird. Then it moved. The phantom did not walk. It did not have to. With a smooth, horrifying grace, it began to glide across the room towards him. It floated a few inches above the floor, its linen-wrapped feet never touching the wooden boards. Its movement was silent, seamless, and utterly unnatural. It was the movement of a thing that was not bound by the clumsy laws of friction and gravity that governed the living world. It was a specter, a thought given form, and it moved with the speed and certainty of a nightmare. With every inch it advanced, the temperature in the room plummeted. The cold was a physical assault, so intense it burned his skin. His breath came in ragged, white plumes. He could feel his blood slowing in his veins, his limbs growing numb and heavy. The phantom was bringing the chill of the grave with it, and it was forcing it upon him. He was being flash-frozen by pure, supernatural hatred. He wanted to run, to scramble away, but his body was locked in a new kind of paralysis, not from a psychic command, but from pure, unadulterated terror. He was a mouse mesmerized by the gaze of a cobra. He could do nothing but watch as the specter of the ancient priester, was it a pharaoh? A king? Drew closer and closer. It was an inexorable approach, as unstoppable as the passage of time. The phantom flowed around the furniture, its form seeming to bend the light around it, creating a small, mobile distortion in reality. The space it occupied was not truly part of the room. It was a bubble of the ancient, dead world, moving through his own. The apparition finally came to a stop. It was now standing directly in front of him, looming over him where he knelt on the floor. It was so close he could see the intricate, spectral weave of the linen bandages, the faint, ghostly hieroglyphs painted on its chest. He was enveloped in its aura of absolute cold. A cold so deep it felt like the final absence of all heat, all life, all hope. He looked up into the two black voids that served as its eyes and felt as if he were falling, tumbling endlessly into a bottomless well of ancient sorrow and rage. He could feel the sheer weight of its hatred, a hatred that had festered for 3,000 years in the silent dark, a hatred for those who had disturbed its rest, who had violated its sacred space, who had stolen its treasures. He, Malcolm Ross, a man of science and logic, was the final focus of that millennia-old wrath. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for a physical blow, for a spectral hand to close around his throat. But the attack, when it came, was far more intimate and infinitely more terrifying. The phantom leaned forward. Its movement was slow, deliberate, a final act of psychological torture. Its lipless mouth did not move. Its hollow eyes did not blink. But as its face came within inches of his own, a voice spoke. The voice did not enter his ears. It was not a sound that traveled through the air. It bypassed his physical senses entirely and was born directly inside his mind. It was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of dust and bones, the sound of a voice that had not been used for 30 centuries and had forgotten how to form words. It was a faint, yet incredibly powerful sound, a mental whisper that was louder than any physical scream. And it spoke. It spoke a few short, guttural words in a language that was long dead, a tongue that had not been heard on Earth since the time of the pyramids. It was the ancient Egyptian language, not the formal script he had studied in books, but a dialect so archaic, so primal, that he could only grasp its meaning through a kind of terrified, intuitive osmosis. The words were not a conversation. They were not a question. They were a judgment. They were a pronouncement. They were a curse. The whisper was a spike of pure, malevolent energy driven directly into the center of his consciousness. The words themselves were less important than the power they carried, the payload of ancient magic and concentrated hatred they delivered. He felt the curse settle into him, a cold, dark seed planted in the fertile soil of his terror. He didn't understand the exact phrasing, but he understood the intent. It was a curse of watching shadows, of sleepless nights, of a mind that would slowly unravel under the weight of a history it could not comprehend. It was a curse of being haunted not just by a ghost, but by the crushing weight of time itself. It was a curse that promised he would never, ever be truly alone again. And as the final, sibilant syllable of the curse echoed and died in the silent auditorium of his mind, the phantom vanished. It did not fade. It did not retreat. It simply ceased to be. One moment it was there, a towering figure of ancient wrath looming over him. The next, there was nothing but empty air, still shimmering with an almost visible cold. The presence was gone. The overwhelming fury had lifted. The room was suddenly, shockingly empty. The vibration in the floor stopped. The hieroglyphic shadows on the wall dissolved back into normal, mundane shapes. The 7 gems on the collar, their duty done, their message delivered, faded from a pulsing green back to their inert, lifeless black. The scent of the tomb and the desert wind dissipated, leaving only the faint, familiar smell of old books and the sharp, clean smell of ozone and fear. The study, though still freezing cold, was his again. The chilling encounter was over. The historical mystery had revealed its terrifying, living heart, and then it had vanished, leaving only devastation in its wake. Malcolm Ross was alone again, truly, utterly alone, except for the cold, and the memory, and the ancient, whispered words that were now a permanent part of him. A curse coiled deep within his soul, patiently waiting. What does this phantom want from him? And what exactly was the ancient curse that it whispered into his soul? Let me know your theories below. Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more Gothic chills from the unseen world.